Good morning. We'll give it just another minute here before we get started. All right. Thanks for joining us. Today we're going to talk just a little bit about solar energy and grid independence. Um, there's a lot of conversation these days about the state of the grid, which we won't go too deep into today. But there are some concerns about the grid capacity, the continual increase of load to the grid, and so the conversation of what can we do as individual homeowners, business owners, to kind of change that dynamic or our dependence upon the grid, and so that's kind of just what we're going to touch on a little bit today. So grid independence. What are the benefits associated with using solar power to help gain that independence? And then we'll touch slightly on battery storage as well and how that plays a factor in it. And then just for joining us on the call today, somebody's going to win a $25 gift card. So we will spin the wheel here at the end and see who is going to get that. So what is grid independence? So definition just means having the ability to produce and consume your own energy without relying on the traditional power grid, right? That's for all of time, we have got our power from the utility company of whatever area we live in. There has been no choices to that. It was built out. It's running to your home. It's running to your business. You are only able to get power from that source, right? That is how this has been for since the beginning of electricity. That's been the way it's been done. And so, over the last couple decades and really now just picking up steam has been the idea of small solar or wind independence, being able to produce your own power on your own property, so that you are not reliant solely on the grid. Okay. And so there's two different ways. We obviously are a solar company, so our conversation will focus on that and compared to some of the other technologies that are out there, being wind or hydro type devices that would produce power as well. But when we look at solar, you'll hear a lot of times on grid or off grid, and people, one of the common misconceptions are, as soon as I put solar on my home or business, I am now off the grid. I'm no longer using the grid at all. And that's not how it works. Typically, very, very rarely do we ever set a system up to be 100% off grid, meaning that we do not have a connection to the power company any longer. And there's a number of reasons for that, but that grid does still serve a purpose even when we have solar, even if we are producing all the power that we need from our solar, that there's an exchange going on between your system and the grid. And so always want that to be clear so people kind of understand how that exchange is happening. Okay. But we are creating some independence. So the benefits, obviously, one of the biggest ones is the cost side of things. We know that inflation took a massive rise over the last few years everywhere. We saw this particularly in utility prices. But the big thing that people need to understand is that just because inflation overall is starting to level out, that's not going to stop the big spikes in electricity costs. Okay, so the electric costs are going to continue to rise pretty significantly based on a few things that we know, right? That the majority of our power currently is coming from fossil fuels. In this area, it's over 80% is from coal power. Okay, coal is cheap, it's efficient, it's a very good producer of electricity. Unfortunately, we also know now that it is very damaging to our environment. In return, then damaging to the humans that are breathing in the air. So, as the EPA has been forcing the utility companies to add cleaners to their coal plants, to start shutting them down, we are seeing these power companies have to make some pretty drastic changes that are very expensive, right? So Ameren, Missouri, for example, here in this area is having to shut down a power plant that was supposed to be running for 90 to 100 years. They're going to be shutting that down after about 45 years. So what happens with that? Well, the cost when they build billion-dollar power plants is spread out over that 100 years. So now if it's only serving half its life, obviously now they've got to recoup that cost of that system, of that power plant that they had originally planned on recouping over the next 50 years. And so only one place that money comes from, it comes from their end user. In addition to that, you've got just the transition then. If we're not using coal, which is cheap and efficient, what are we using? Fortunately, we are doing a lot more renewables, even at utility scale, but that's not going to cover the entire usage and needs. And so Ameren, Missouri has said that they plan to put in a natural gas plant. If you look at the cost of natural gas, you look at electricity prices anywhere that's using that as a primary fuel source, and you will see that they're paying 2 to 3 times the rates that we see here in the Midwest. So we know that utility costs are going to continue to rise and rise and rise. So one of the big benefits from gaining your independence from that is the overall long-term savings of owning your own power. So the other thing that it does is it starts to take off some of the strain on the grid. Okay, so energy security is kind of a term used when saying that I'm not at risk anymore, right, from the power company. So just by putting solar on your home or your business, you are producing power locally. Now, this does not protect you. Solar by itself does not protect you if the grid goes out. We will talk about how that's done here in a few slides, but it's important to know that just by putting solar in, we are now taking some of the strain off the grid, right? We've seen it's been happening in California for years where they have rolling blackouts, rolling brownouts. Texas started having this issue, right, where they simply cannot produce and push enough power into the grid to cover all the need at certain periods of time. The grid was built out, the infrastructure for this, was really, most of that work was done in the 60s, 1960s. And if you do a quick look, you can see that we're using more than 2 times the amount of electricity now that we were back then. Okay, so obviously it's putting a lot more strain on a grid that they had no intentions on being used to that capacity at the time. More and more as we're seeing the urban areas, cities populations continue to grow, people moving out of the rural areas into the cities. We're putting more and more and more strain on a grid that needs continuous upgrades. We're moving to electric vehicles. We're putting more strain by charging all these vehicles. So when you install solar, you are helping to relieve that strain because you are now basically taking your property off of that grid for the most part. So you're not putting the strain. In addition, when your system is producing more power than your home or your business needs, you're pushing power back into the grid. So you're actually putting some support back into the grid there to help stabilize things. So we kind of touched on this, right? The reliability of your energy. the cost savings, and then of course the environmental impact. Solar panels are not, it does take power to in the factories to produce them, but once a solar panel is produced, it is then making power for the next 30, 40, 50 years without creating any kind of carbon footprint. So a huge advantage there from environmental impact on top of the cost savings, on top of the grid support that we were just talking about. Okay, so then when we talk about getting full independence, right, from the grid, that's where the battery conversations come in. Okay, and we're going to do some future webinars where we'll dive deeper into battery technology and the different options out there. But today, just wanted to provide you with a little bit of the big picture, the overview. So solar as a whole, solar panels, the inverters, what produces the power, right? That has pretty much hit its current max capacity, lowest price. We figured that out. We see over the last several years a massive switch to the research and development on the battery technology side, right? We know we can produce the power we need with the solar panels, but obviously if the sun's not shining, which happens every single day, that power that we're producing, if we can't store it to use at a different time, well, then we haven't created an opportunity for full independence. So battery technology has been taking huge leaps over the last several years. And we know that there's more coming over the next handful of years as well. This is where you gain that full capability of independence. Now, even when we're installing batteries, very, very rarely are we doing a full disconnect from the grid. We are going to stay connected to the grid because what happens to your solar panels are going to collect the sunlight. It creates a DC current. Your home runs on AC current, so that's where the inverter comes into play and actually converts that power from DC to AC. And then our home or our business uses the power that it needs from that. If there's more power being produced than what's being used, if we have a battery, then the next thing that power is going to do is going to charge up the batteries. After that battery is full, or if we don't have a battery, then the extra power is getting pushed back into the grid. Okay, and so every utility company has what's called a net metering policy, and that dictates what kind of compensation or how you exchange power with the grid once you have a solar system. That's a kind of an individual conversation based on your individual home and the utility company you're with. But with that battery, then so we charge up our battery, we're still pushing power back into the grid. Above that, we can pull power from the grid when we need it. And so typically that's the situation we want to stay in versus going 100% off grid, because what that means is that you've got to be able to produce and store enough power on a day-by-day basis. So which can be pretty challenging. Middle of the winter, we have multiple days in a row where we don't see any sunshine. So you're getting very, very little power production. So that's why for most people, it doesn't make sense to go 100% off grid. But we can make ourselves very independent from relying on the grid. With that battery technology, you can store enough power so that if the grid does go down, we start to experience some of those blackouts that we talked about. Heaven forbid something happens to the grid, right? There's been a lot of talk of the grid being a target for terrorist attacks. If we saw something like that where we were without power for a significant amount of time from the grid, you may not run day-to-day life exactly how you do now, running solely off your batteries in your solar, but you could operate very, very close to that on an ongoing basis, and really allowing yourself to be completely independent from the need or the reliance on the grid. So that's really the gist of what I wanted to touch on today. Just wanted to kind of open up the big picture of this conversation of being independent from the grid there. And if you would like to have a more direct one-on-one conversation about your particular home or business and what that independence would look like, you've got our phone number here, our website. You can go on, you can gain some more information there, or schedule an appointment to talk to one of our solar experts that can dig into it and really get deep into the weeds with you on what that would look like for your particular property. All right, so now, let's see here. Oops, I'm gonna stop sharing for a minute. If I can find. All right, share, get this pulled up. I'm gonna share the wheel so we can spin it. Let's see, okay. All right, everybody that joined us, name is on here. I'm gonna give it a spin. Let's see who our lucky winner is. Ooh. Jeanette, all right, congratulations. We will be emailing you with your gift card. Again, thank you everybody for joining us, and be looking out for additional webinars coming up where we'll be taking a deep dive into batteries. We'll do some individual ones on a number of your big name batteries, just to name a few: Tesla, Enphase, Franklin, as well as some others. So stay tuned for that information, and thank you for joining us.